Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the IRR webinar titled Four Transformative Bills for a Free, Fairer, and Prosperous South Africa. My name is Makone Maja. I am the Strategic Engagements Manager here at the Institute, and I'm joined by two of my colleagues, Hermann Pretorius, who is our Head of Strategic Communications and IRR Fellow, as well as Director of IRR Legal, Gabriel Crouse. Thank you both for joining me this morning. I will start with you, Herman, about just an overview about these bills being part of the What South Africa Can Be campaign, which is a campaign that promises a South Africa that's rooted in freedom, economic growth, and non-racialism. I read a comment, I think it was on the Daily Friend, when the idea of these bills were launched, where somebody was responding to them and saying, is the IRR now entering a political realm where it once said that it would not, by proposing bills that would be launched in Parliament? How does the Institute plead?
Not guilty, Your Honor. So I think the reality is that concept legislation and policy work, all to my mind, still live in the solution space. And that is sort of the thing that I always try to say to people: what's the difference between a political party and a think tank? A think tank writes recipes, a political party makes dishes. We don't make the dishes, and I consider these to still be recipes, perhaps recipes with finer points of guidance, more granular than our usual stuff. But it isn't, I think, straying into politics at all. It doesn't assume a public political battle to get these bills through Parliament and onto the President's desk. It is very much still in the battle of ideas space, where we remain non-political in the sense that any political party who likes these bills, who want to adopt them, are free to adopt them. One of the things that you cannot be, if you're in the think tank space, is sort of very protective over your ideas, because the very point of what we do is to spread our ideas as far as possible. So no, I don't think we are entering politics. I certainly don't want us to enter politics. And it is, I think, still quite firmly in line with the idea of making sure that good ideas gain momentum and bad ideas lose momentum. And the idea of getting to this bills process was quite deliberate, in the sense that it helps us get as far as possible without entering into politics with the work that we do. Because quite often people need not only to understand or appreciate that there is a solution of a certain policy type, but also to understand how it might start to look in practice. And that is something that I think think tanks across the world struggle with, is to translate ideas into almost a teaser trailer of how that story would play out in reality. So the bills are sort of trying to get us as close as possible to that idea of, these are great ideas, but how would they look in practice? How would they work in practice? So it is moving the conversation away from the purely theoretical towards the more concrete and tangible. But I don't think we depart the safe ground of responsible recipe writing. We're not making dishes.
Nice. What I also like about these bills is that, and can appreciate, is they respond to a genuine need of solutions in our political realm. And I think you can see, even with the political parties that have emerged recently, is that they sort of recycle the same ideas in politics. no novelty. They're not offering something new or unique to solve challenges that have plagued South Africa for quite some time. And I think we can appreciate that the IRR is not just sitting on the sidelines, critiquing policy, but also offering tangible solutions that can be applied and in practice, as it helps South Africa achieve, those levels of growth that are needed. And I should say, I see we've already received some questions in the chat. You are invited to submit those questions. We have allocated about 20 to 15 minutes to addressing your questions. So do be invited and feel free to add more questions should you have any. And let's go to the first bill that launched all of this, the No More Race Laws bill. I think
Can I
Gabriel.
just jump in there?
Yes, please go ahead.
I just want to say something about what Herman said. So I think that it's worth bearing. If you Google the meaning of politics, I just looked it up. Cambridge Dictionary gives one version: the activities of the government, members of lawmaking organizations, or people who try to influence the way a country is governed. So that's a pretty standard definition of politics. It's not the only one. I think the one that Herman was using was partisan politics. And I think that's the one that Makone was using too. And partisan politics is defined by the activities of those who seek power through the vote, or, sometimes partisans, in the case of a civil war or an oppressive situation where you have a foreign force that's invaded, will be people who seek power through direct force of violence. Partisan insurrection is against the Nazis in occupied France. So we are not partisan. A nice way to put that. I liked Herman's thing with the recipe and the chef who cooks. Another way to think about it is, do we go out with a sword or a pen? And in a way, every politician who asks for your vote is asking for you to put a sword in their hand, because they direct the way the monopoly on legitimate force moves. We are not trying to get a sword in our hand. That is a sharp distinction between us and them. We just have a microphone, a screen. And I think that fits very much with what Herman is saying, but just using a slightly different definition of the word politics, which is sometimes used in the one way and sometimes in the other. Wanted to keep that clear. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel. And to your point of, actually being political and trying to influence our politics, so much of South Africa's politics, long after apartheid has ended, has been racial. And the key bill that launches the What I Say Can Be bills, being the No More Race Laws bill, tries to finally put that, racialization and emphasis of it by our government behind us. Just a background from you, Hermann, about the No More Race Laws bill and how it came about.
I think it is particularly sort of in a weird way satisfying to see the debate that is currently going on in the country. Satisfying in a very particular sense, because what we see currently, I think, with Solidariteit's very provocative banner that they put up in Johannesburg, the Johannesburg local government removing it, the question of race-based classification, identification. It is quite pleasing to almost link up to your first question, to park the IRR's vehicle firmly on the solutions level of this particular parkade. Of course, we do often try to stir public debate. When we wrote to the G20 leaders, asking them to please submit to the South African presidency a breakdown of the racial delegation or the racial makeup of their delegations, that was a deliberate attempt to stir a bit, and stir certainly we did. So we might walk on the other floors of this particular parquet, but I think what distinguishes the IRR from other participants in the battle of ideas space is that we have a genuine commitment to solutions that can work, that aren't necessarily, trying simply to drive one side of the argument, but to get us to a conclusive point in the argument where either there's common ground or the argument is just won quite convincingly. And one of the very clear points of this debate of race in South Africa, to my mind, stood out from Section 9 of the Constitution. And now, Section 9 of the Constitution is the so-called equality clause that makes this post 1996 dispensation fundamentally different from what went before it. Of course, there are other components. We had parliamentary sovereignty, now we have constitutional sovereignty, and there are many things, but one of the key differences in spirit and normative objective that we have post 94, post 96 versus before is this idea that identity can no longer be weaponized to the extent that the apartheid government and preceding governments had weaponized it. And Section 9 of the Constitution contains within it this idea that you have fair and unfair discrimination. And I think all South Africans have been so put on high alert for discrimination that once we hear discrimination, we just put our backs up and immediately suspect malevolence. But fair discrimination would be something like me not being cast as Nelson Mandela in a theatre play. It's completely reasonable. I'm just not tall enough. And the fact of fair discrimination is when it is not demeaning, insulting, denying of dignity for someone to be preferred for a function or a role compared to someone else. And that is actually fair discrimination, something that exists in free societies. By marrying my wife, I fairly discriminated against many others whom I didn't marry. So this idea of discrimination, we shouldn't just hear discrimination immediately jump to a horrendous conclusion. And what the No More Race Laws Bill tries to do is tries to, for the first time, figure out what fair racial discrimination would look like, because it exists as a concept in our constitution. It exists in reasonable, rational thought. And what essentially stands behind the entire bill is this idea that if we're going to assume that Section 9 is worth it, which I think it is, if we're going to assume that Section 9 is not only worth it, but is a fair mechanism of practice, not just a theoretical statement, then we must understand what is the difference between fair and unfair racial discrimination. If we then take the historical context and assume that apartheid has to fail the Section 9 test. The 1950s Population Registration Act must fail the test of unfair discrimination. Otherwise, the constitutional settlement becomes a bit absurd. It becomes useful to understand what was it about the 1950s Act of the Population Registration Act that was unfair in its racial classification and racial discrimination. And that is where the idea came from, that there can be something like fair racial discrimination in South Africa, but it must be voluntary, it must not be state coerced, and it must be free of beneficial or detrimental consequences linked to policy. Because Stats SA measures Black poverty and white poverty and employment and unemployment. These are good things to know about a country as ours with its race-defined history. It's important for us to be able to make the argument, as Gabriel has made brilliantly in his work, that on the numbers, it is about, since 2015 at least, the Black middle class is numerically larger than the white middle class in South Africa. That is a good, fair use of racial classification because it shows us how we can understand our country better. But what the No More Race Laws Bill does is it prevents that sort of ability to say you're Black, you're white, or you say you're Black, you say you're white, from meaning, you get a slightly favorable treatment from the government and you get slightly detrimental treatment from the government. So that's essentially the thinking behind it, is an attempt to, for the first time in writing, in black and white, show South Africans what a moderate, fair form of racial discrimination could look like and what its limits would be on policies like, BEE, Black economic empowerment, or white economic empowerment, if we want to take the historical caricature. So that really tickled me, and that's where the law came from, where the bill came from.
And Gabriel, Hermann directs us to Section 9 of the Constitution, right, which prohibits discrimination on all these levels, including race. From just conversations I've had with people, there's a sense that in order to usher in fair or transformation, there needs to be fair discrimination applied in favor of Blacks, basically racial empowerment, in order to provide redress. How are you thinking through those ideas, and whether that is or repealing race laws would be antithetical to transformation, and whether we need racial redress to act as a form of fair discrimination?
Thank you. I think that in answering that question, I'm going to lean back on some points that Hermann made, which I think it's probably going to take South Africans a few years to realize how brilliant the insights are that he has distilled in that bill and in what he's just said here. First, let me just put up some nets, so to speak. One net is conceptual distinctions. When you have tennis, it's much easier if you've got the lines neatly drawn and the thing is up before you start playing. One difference that is very common sense, but that if you listen to the leading editors and producers, newsmakers in the country, you would struggle to understand, is the difference between the present and the past. So if you listen, the way you framed that question, there was no distinction between the present and the past, and I think that's very good the way you framed that question, because I think it reflects the way the debate goes. But now let's look at the difference between the present and the past. Is it conceivable that maybe in 1994, maybe in 1996, maybe in 1998, there was a need for race-based positive discrimination in favor of some Black people in order to solve some specific problems, but that there's a difference between 1994, 1996, 1998, and 2004, 2006, 2008, and yet again that there's a difference between that and 2014, and not to belabor that 2025 is its own whole other story. I have had these debates on multiple platforms through the years, and whenever, without fail, I speak to BEE proponents about the need to get rid of BEE today, I get told about the need to have BEE in 1996. I find it frustrating. Now, I don't want to be too vague. I will give an example of where pro-Black affirmative action was almost certainly necessary. In the police force and in the military, you had a lot of people, some of them were Black, by the way, but you had a lot of people who were racist and had administered brutal, extra-legal attacks on South Africans who sought to end apartheid. Steve Biko did not die of a hunger strike. He was killed, and it was covered up. And it was covered up by a very large number of people. And were it not for Gluckman, the forensic pathologist, and himself a Nazi killer, and a great man, a great South African, a brave man, we would never have known. And Helen Ziller and those who were involved in exposing that story. So you take over an armed force unit, and I won't belabor this point either, but our former CEO, Franz Crinier, he had some stories to tell about, and he was no shrinking violet, but some stories to tell about some very serious racist goings on there. To get rid of that in a rapid fashion that legitimizes the police probably does take a little bit of affirmative action. The Institute of Race Relations itself, former CEO John Cain Berman, implemented some affirmative action. Constant Viljoen, the last general of apartheid and the founding force behind the Freedom Front Plus, approved of pro-black race-based affirmative action. Today you might find some people associated with some other think tanks who say there was never any good idea behind race-based affirmative action. It was always terrible. And, especially young people who try and show how brave and clever they are, they'll say it was always bad all the way through. But if you go to the 1990s, you will not find one member of parliament, one political party, and I don't think you'll find one serious organization that said there is no room for any form of race-based discrimination by the state at all. Because at the time, the viciousness of apartheid and the extent to which it had been supported was still very much on the front of people's minds. And so, you look at the referendum in 1992, the all-white referendum to end apartheid. 2/3 voted to end apartheid. Most South Africans, and the Institute was the leading organization in the country, in the world, to say most South Africans, black, white, Indian, colored, want to get along together without attending to race. But the third of white South Africans who voted to keep apartheid, many of them were in organs of state. Many of them, the old fundamental jokes or whatever about going into home affairs back in the day, we have our jokes today. Let me tell you, there were jokes like that back then, and they had a good reason for it. There was a lot of incompetent, nepotistic, racist appointments of quite useless people who were very worried about losing their jobs if there was a merit-based system, and they were afraid of a merit-based system. And so you have to worry about what they then do if they can avoid a merit-based system by, only promoting people who think like them and look like them. But Makone, how old were you in 1994? Dare I ask?
Wasn't born yet.
Ooh, Hermann, you were just about, you were 3. Okay, so that is this once 3-year-old baby now has hair on his face. This lovely lady didn't even exist. Okay, it is literally a lifetime ago. So the thought that maybe at that stage things were like that is one thought. But today, when the black middle class outnumbers the white middle class, that's one reason. If you look at within organs of state, within the police, within the top brass of the armed forces, the judiciary, you go through all of the organs of state, majority black senior management throughout, and has been since at least 2010. And there is no country on earth that is taken seriously for doing affirmative action where the group that they're affirming is also the majority of the armed forces, the prosecution, the judiciary, and the middle class and the upper class. Okay, that is how apartheid worked, by the way. Apartheid did have the majority were white Afrikaners, or whites more broadly, and they were like, no, we still need a help. And you can tell you're really in trouble when you're sounding like the apartheid state. And that's the point that Hermann made again about population registration. Okay, so this is a long intro to say the past and the present are very different. And they're not just different because of time, they're different because of massive changes in wealth, income, and power. Today, the proper way, I think, to read section 9.3, 9, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 of the Equality Clause of the Constitution is to say, yes, unfair discrimination based on race is prohibited. Some fair discrimination is allowed context-based. The context no longer allows for the state to credibly, legitimately redirect the guns from one race to another race, to force the money to go from one race to another race. That's really what state-backed redistribution looks like. So that's why the third point Hermann said is the state should be in no position to discriminate on the basis of race in terms of policy that produces disparate outcomes intentionally based on race. The second and first thing is voluntarism is the way that naturally deals with this. If you say you are whatever you say you are, and then you say, but we're going to give 1,000 Rand tax rebate to everyone who identifies as black on their SARS application form. Well, then you're just putting a number on how much you get for being black, and I will definitely take 1,000 Rand, most gladly. I have danced in many shebeens, and I've been told that I can sometimes make some moves that qualify me. What is it? And by the way, that is a funny point. I'm glad you guys are laughing. Have you looked Hermann referred to the 1953 Population Registration Act. If you look at the apartheid law, they said you can judge someone's race by their comportment and accent and by the style of dress that they choose to wear. So the notion that someone can put on a pantsula outfit and do a little sigalekeke, if I'm allowed to say that on, that's a very 2000s reference to a kind of dance move. But the notion that could get you reclassified was an apartheid notion. The notion that you could, but it would not be voluntary. It would be the case that some white guy would have his R's and his accent would be a bit flat. You talk a little bit like this because of something. And then they would say, well, we are going to call you colored. And now you can't go to school with your sister. And that happened. Brother and sister were split because of different racial classification, ultimately to do with different presentation. So that is crazy when it's forced. If it's voluntary, what most people are going to do most of the time is they're going to identify in ways that are mostly understandable and that allow us to get this data that explains, like, how has wealth and income distributions changed? How can we feel confident about the fact that we're now in a strong new rainbow nation, which we are. So I think that the proper way to interpret Section 9 of the Constitution includes an understanding of time and history to start. The Constitution says everything must be interpreted historically. History doesn't end in 1994. It continued and things changed. And that which was allowed and which made sense in the 90s does not make sense and should not be allowed and is not consistent with the Constitution in the 2020s. What is consistent with the Constitution in the 2020s is a draft bill drafted by Hermann Pretorius, published by the Institute of Race Relations, that any political party should take up and table for the benefit of this country to finally have the statutory system be in line with the constitutional system.
Thank you, Gabriel. I am going to stop you before you start identifying as more racial groups, any more racial groups in our country.
And I'm going to ask you start again.
No, I'm going to ask both of you to limit your responses a bit so that we have enough time for Q&A. And I myself have now a question for you in Q&A, just after a recent confrontation I had with the DDG of Employment and Labor on how there are still so many disparities, particularly in the boardroom. And I think, Hermann, you and I have also had discussions with people about that, where they say, well, that actually demonstrates that we need to double down on racial redress. But we'll come back to that during Q&A. Let's go to value for money, the value for money bill. And Gabriel, here I am going to come back to you. You did author the value for money bill. And when I think of value for money, it's such a common sense principle that we apply and negotiate daily as South Africans. You almost brought up my age there, but I was thinking even back to my childhood, how when I'd get tuck shop money, I'd think of, like packing a lunchbox instead of spending it on a pie, so that I could use it for something else. That money would take me further if I had extra to buy all the things that I wanted instead of using it to buy a pie. I was also thinking about how, as the year's winding down, all the Stokvel ladies are coming together to go and stockpile at Macro to buy in bulk. They've been saving throughout the year, and they're preparing now, consolidating their books to go and buy in bulk, because you get more value for money per unit cost when you buy in bulk, and there's so many of you saving towards this goal. But we make these decisions daily, negotiating value for money as South Africans. And as a common sense idea, that element of common sense isn't realized in government. Just what about value for money convicted you to take it and produce it into a bill?
Yeah, I think exactly what you landed on there. It's something that binds us all. And that's not to say everyone is equally good at it. In my family, when I was in my 20s, when December would come and we'd go down to Durban, it was always my sister who would arrange the flights, and then we would pay her back, right? Because she knew, like, if you book on a Tuesday morning or whatever the story was, on average, it'll be up to 20% less. If you left it to me, I would book the flights, maybe in the airport. I recognized in myself, I think partly, that I was not a great achiever of value for money. And so part of what makes a society function well, Adam Smith nailed this, is a division of labor. So things go really well in an office if you can say, well, Makone has learned how to do value for money very nicely because of, packing her tuck shop things, so that skipping the pie so that she could get the nice things on the weekend that she wanted. And she has developed that skill, and she has both by the book, she's gotten some formal training, and by just, practice, and then people around her like leaning on her. An effective government relies on those specialists in value for money, and they are very overlooked. People who like accounting, people who like coupons, people who like, when you go to the grocery store, are you the one who has the smart shopper card or whatever it is? I'm not. I'm useless at that stuff. But the one who is the one who should be buying the thing for the whole team, if you can do that. So the way the South African system works is it takes the people who have got the value for money procurement job. They're supposed to get value for money. And then it says to them, I want you to spend 80% of your brain power getting value for money. Then I want you to spend 20% of your brain power promoting racial redress. And I'm going to make you do it with a system that's very hard to understand. And the Zondo report is really the thing that changed my mind about how important this is. Because the Zondo report said at the heart of state capture is the fact that the good people buying with now 1.2 trillion rand, the stuff that the government, it's like it's like a seventh of GDP, so it's like one day of the week. It's just government money being spent by these people who are supposed to promote value for money. And they've been asked to do something so confusing that the acting chief procurement officer at Treasury, Vili Matibula, said half the time people are stealing on purpose. Half the time they don't even know they're doing the wrong thing because it's so confusing. And the Zondo report said, you're not going to solve state, I'm paraphrasing, you're not going to solve state capture unless you say to the value for money people, seriously, do value for money. We will think, should you build a classroom here or there? Should you use the money to plant trees, or should you use it to build highways? We'll figure that out. By the time it gets to you, I just want you to get the best laptop for the cheapest price. I want you to get the best bricks that'll last the longest for the cheapest price. And yeah, I mean, Hermann and I discussed this on the last presentation of that bill at length, so I won't go into it at length here. But this is such a common sense idea that 80% of the population, well, our survey showed 80% of people want value for money. And half of them say we want value for money, but if there's a tie, we want it to go to the black company. And half of them say if we want value for money, we don't care if there's a tie, flip a coin. But only 20% say you must pay extra for BEE and deviate from value for money. It's disappointing to me that the DA has come in with their bill, which has gotten a lot of attention. It deviates from value for money. No one has looked at their scorecard, I think, outside of the think tank space. But if you look at their scorecard, which they published, they say 80% for value for money and 20% for social development goals. And on price, they say 30% for price and 20% for social development goals, which means you can charge 2.6 times extra. If we have just like a tuck shop scenario where school feeding schemes are very important in rural areas where these kids don't have any money to pack lunch or go to the tuck shop. Let's say you've got like R1 million a year that's allocated to that school to feed 1,000 kids every day for the year. Someone has to buy the sampan beans, the millipap, the ground bones to add some protein, the bone-in chicken from time to time, the sugar that goes in the water to make the juice. Someone has to buy that stuff. And as you've said, they can buy it in a smart fashion that you get more for less, than the kids can get more better stuff, or they can buy it in a stupid fashion where you're spending more for getting less. The ANC system, there's a 25% cap on the premium. So you can get 25% less, spend 25% more for BEE. The DA thing, it's a 260% cap. Someone can say, we'll sell you the same amount of stuff for 2.6 times the price and win the contract because they plant trees elsewhere and that gets them social development goals. So that's not a system that is commonsensical. There's not 80% of the population wants that. So Hermann spoke very eloquently about the battle of ideas, about us trying to influence the whole conversation. We want any political party that's listening here to hear that if they want to get something that 80% of the population likes and that would help service delivery, they can take this bill, put it in Parliament, and they'd be doing the country a service. Thank you.
Herman, do you have anything to say about, the transformation elements of this? Because when BEE is ushered in, we're promised, this transformation. And when Gabriel gives the example of feeding schemes, I think, in whose right mind would prioritizing enriching, a tenderpreneur over ensuring that more children are fed and fed, more nutrient dense meals. When you're thinking of those sort of distinctions and balancing that equation, what role do you attribute transformation to these sort of examples that, Gabriel specifically brings to my mind?
So one of the things that that I think has buttressed BEE for as long as it has is its label. It is called Black Economic Empowerment. Words with which I think very few reasonable people can disagree. But it's sort of like the People's Democratic Republic of North Korea. It isn't the people's, it isn't democratic, and it isn't a republic, but it is North Korea. The problem with BEE is it is the North Korea of South African legislation. I'm willing to put money on the fact that if you went up to ordinary South Africans and asked them, what do you think an empowerment policy does? They would say something that comes down to the fact that it brings opportunity closer to the ordinary person. In that sense, BEE isn't an empowerment policy. It is a procurement favoritism policy. It was cleverly named, shrewdly named, but the fact is BEE, in the system as it is designed, is not about how can we push opportunity as close to the nuclei and the crevices of poverty as possible. It is actually just how can we take the established, relatively sophisticated part of the economy we call procurement and give it a racial tinge. And the problem with that is it is based on stuff like share ownership, management level posts, BEE procurement within your own circle. You get BEE points on the scorecard if you procure from other BEE companies. So it rigs the system very much in favor of a high level of economic engagement and sophistication already. If you're going to ask a poor South African what their view is on share ownership, then you're going to get an answer of, I'm sorry, I haven't thought about that. I was wondering where my kid's next meal would come from. And BEE operates under the label of empowerment in substance as a procurement rigging policy. And that was something that made Gabriel's case in reading and rereading the Value for Money Bill so unavoidably clear, is that the best thing you can do for real transformation is value for money. And I think there's a psychological element here. Value for money is quite often seen as, oh, it's the auditor's answer, it's the penny pinchers, it's the Excel spreadsheet thinker. But if we think in pure practical terms, that those people most reliant on state delivery are the poorest, the most vulnerable, and 90% Black. So if you're going to think that value for money is making sure every rand spent by the government goes as far as possible, then you realize that the most compassionate thing a South African government can do is value for money delivery. Because then, instead of building 80 RDP homes, you can build 85. Instead of tarring 9 kilometers of road connecting the township almost to the nearest economic hub, you can pave 10 kilometers and actually connect the township to the economic hub. So that was sort of my Damascene moment of going, value for money is compassion. A state has a compassionate responsibility to make sure that every rand it spends goes as far as it possibly can. And that's what made it so tragic in a way, is that value for money is so common sense for our ordinary people in our household. I'm also not the person in charge of the flight booking, but that is sort of a self-preservation status of making sure that as a household, we can do as much as possible with what we have. The government goes beyond self-preservation. It has a larger responsibility to actually look after the vulnerable and the poor. That's why taxpayers, I think, in South Africa haven't rebelled en masse yet, because we see around us the necessity for that compassion to be organized and funded. And that is what makes the state's allergic reaction to value for money so tragic, because on the one hand, you've got compassion, and on the other hand, you have bosasa. And I think a last point to my answer, something that Gabriel's work on this also touches on, is people mustn't misunderstand corruption. Corruption isn't by definition criminal or illegal. Transparency International's definition of corruption is the abuse of a mandate or entrusted mandate for private gain. Nothing about crime, nothing about illegality. So if we want to tackle corruption of the scale of Bosasa and the Guptas, it's not going to be good enough to do the Batman thing. At some point, we're going to have to do the compassion thing of making sure that this rand, that this taxpayer paid, has the cleanest, clearest, most transparent path to helping that poor community. That's actually value for money.
Thank you. I'm now firmly worried about time. So I'm going to ask us to speed through the last two bills, being the Right to Own Bill, which responds to the Expropriation Act, as well as the Freedom from Poverty Bill. And we have some very interesting conversation happening in the comments, lots of nice questions there. So I ask you, if you have any more, remember to type them. And I'm rushing so that we can get to those questions. The Right to Own Bill. It reaffirms, the importance of property rights in a democratic country as the cornerstone of human rights, economic growth, social stability, which we first-handedly experienced when we launched it in Bromfisherville, a township in Soweto. One of the young gentlemen we spoke to there, Hotazo, we have a video of him on the website. You can connect on our YouTube channel, on the IRR's YouTube channel. You can go and have a look there. But one of the things he was describing to us is the disharmony that, not having access to secure tenure has caused in Bromfisherville. I'd like you to speak about that, Hermann. But before that, let me ask Gabriel to share his interesting insights about the elements of compensation, because the Right to Own Bill seeks to entrench just and equitable compensation as a key component when expropriation does take place. Gabriel, you go, and then I'll come back to Hermann to address and tie in the housing vouchers, market-driven incentives, as well as the formalization of tenure. Again, if we could speed run through this section.
Okay, so the speed run is this. Basically, what this bill does in part is to take what the Constitutional Court and the lower courts have already said and distill it and enshrine it as black letter law. So in every country, a lot of people, I didn't know this until I started hanging out with lawyers. Like, there's two kinds of laws. Some laws are made up by Parliament. They write it down. They pass it as a bill. We vote. Other laws, the judges just kind of say their opinion on this case, and then that becomes the law because it becomes precedent. But it's extra nice if you can carry the one over to the other. And what the courts have already said is that the purpose of compensation is to compensate. So if I take your things away and then I give you back nothing, I have not compensated you. The notion of nil compensation is, it's a sort of silly thing, but I can put it like this. If I take something away from you that's worth nothing to you, and then I give you nothing, then I have compensated you for your loss. So you can have nil compensation, technically. And there was once a case, very briefly, there was some gravel deep under the ground. It was so far away and so deep under the ground that the cost of extracting it and moving it around and selling it was going to exceed the value that the person would get out of it. The only way it became useful is the government built a highway right next door. And then they said, well, it's suddenly useful to us. We're going to take it out the ground. We'll rehabilitate your land, but we're not going to pay you anything because you didn't lose anything that was valuable to you. So you can have null compensation, but only if it's for a null value of the thing that was taken away. And if the thing is taken away and it's worth 10 million rand, you can't get half, you can't get 5 million rand. We don't want to lose this fight of like, oh, we win against null, but we lose against half. We want full compensation. If you are expropriated, you must be restored insofar as money can do it to exactly the same position you were in before the expropriation. That's what the courts have said. That's what the bill says. Boom.
Jump in, Hermann.
So I might have held the pen on right to own, but Gabriel's insight of value, of what he just explained, was a critical factor looming over my shoulder, almost like, sort of my bust of William Gladstone there. Because at the end of the day, if you are going to get below market value compensation, a portion of your asset, you are losing for zero compensation. So there's no way of getting around the fact that below fair market value compensation translates to at least some flavor of no compensation. And very briefly, as someone who really sort of one of my favorite subjects when I studied law was this idea of judicial interpretation. And it gives you this understanding that there are no mistakes in law. Yeah, there are mistakes in law, but if you read from the perspective that there are no mistakes in law, you start understanding that words were chosen with specificity. Our constitution isn't fair, just an equitable remuneration. It isn't just an equitable payment. It isn't just an equitable remittance or reimbursement. It is compensation. That is a deliberately chosen word with 1,000 years of legal history behind its meaning. And that is crucial to Gabriel's insight here, is the framers of our constitution had synonyms available that would have meant something else, or near synonyms. They chose a specific word. Either you have to redefine 1,000 years of common law tradition as to what compensation means, or you could just go the plain language route that all law schools try to teach in South Africa, that words carry the on-the-face meaning they seem to carry. And in that sense, the choice of the framers to go with compensation and no other word is probably the strongest weapon in our arsenal as we fight against this. And that is something that we cannot let go. And Gabriel's work on this was crucial to the right to own bill.
Thank you for that. I can also appreciate, the inclusion of the word compensation wasn't haphazard and that its meaning should be reinforced. And the Expropriation Act attempts to erode that. But I do invite our audience to go have a look at the short documentary we put together where we launched the Right to Own Bill in Fisherville. There, the community still have issues with secure title, and it's just led to a whole upheaval of issues within the community itself, and it's invited nefarious entities to come and try to take advantage of some of those community members. So there are various points that this Right to Own Bill addresses, including the elements of just and equitable compensation as shared by Gabriel and Hermann, the issue of housing vouchers, as well as finally formalizing and issuing title deeds to communities such as Fisherville. Okay. And lastly, the Freedom from Poverty Bill. So, Herman, you parked the issue of BEE firmly in as, just a procurement law. And I think that's true of the BEE Act. But I think BEE has become synonymous with a few other things, right? Racial policies in general. And I think the Freedom from Poverty Bill, through economic empowerment for the disadvantaged, addresses other components of BE outside of procurement. Just a brief overview there of this Freedom from Poverty Bill and EED, which is one of my favorite inventions ever from the Institute.
So the Freedom from Poverty Bill does what BEE pretends to do, is it takes a fair look at where there is a concentration of resources, the state, where there is huge commercial bargaining power, the state, where there is a moral and a constitutional obligation to act with compassion and redress, the state. And it assumes that those tools at the state's disposal can and should be used to eradicate poverty, or at least to turn the tide in the war against it. And that's what a voucher does. And that's why I truly am in love with the idea of a voucher, because it takes, in a way, the best of all possible ideologies and puts it into a very pragmatic little capsule. The socialist should like this because it gives the state a fundamental role of stepping into the firing line for the worker, for the hard done by, for the exploited. The capitalist should love this because it transforms dependent people into consumers in a market where they can choose. The social justice activist should love this because it rebalances power hierarchies so that those left out of dignity and decision, it gives them the opportunity to actually exercise those. You can go through it. The libertarian gets their way because it essentially replaces large swathes of government decision-making infrastructure and bureaucracy. So it has, again, an intense simplicity, a common senseness to it that works from the principle those who deserve help should get help. And that is why when we look at the real barriers to economic empowerment, it will be stuff like housing, education, and healthcare. And there are about 20 other possible, barriers to economic empowerment. If you think a kid born in Atteridgeville today, if you see economic empowerment as them reaching the middle class within the next 2.5 decades, then you can start thinking practically. And that's why the Freedom from Poverty Bill comes in as I think something immensely practical. Where we've got a housing crisis in South Africa, it takes the resources and the might of the state and puts it in the hands of those who can and should and want to choose a better home residential environment for them. The same with education, the same with healthcare. It is, I think, one of the most creative policies that actually becomes an empowerment policy, where BEE has claimed to be that, only to peter out at the procurement level. And Makone, you and I have recently chatted. We should start calling it triple BEE is boardroom-based Black economic empowerment. And EED is exactly not that. It goes beyond the boardroom to actual economic empowerment on these key areas of housing, education, and healthcare.
Thank you, Herman. I would love to give you the final word on this, Gabriel, but because we're short for time, what I'll do instead is ask you the first two questions that we received actually at the top of the hour, even before the webinar began. It's from, there's two of them. The first is from Chris Oppenheim, and he asks, all these bills may have merit. However, do you intend to convince the government to adopt these bills? While they are currently looting the state and are set in their ways of blaming the past and having a sense of self-entitlement. The second one is from GJ Pretorius, and he asks, will the IRR try to convince the DA to adopt the value for money bill? Is it is sort of fits in. Okay, I think he meant it sort of fits in with their proposal, just with savings, which you actually kind of addressed already. Off you go, Gabriel.
Thanks, Makone. So, look, there's also a hard side to this. I had IRR legal, sorry, and like on the expropriation thing, we're going to court. We have a court date by the end of November to deal with an interlocutory matter, and we should have our full trial in March next year to try and strike down the Parliament's attempt to transgress the Constitution. And so, in that sense, yeah, we recognize that there are very serious communists, socialists, race nationalists, Marxists, and so on, who have managed to get the guns, so to speak, in their hands. They've gotten the sword, the power of the state, and they've tried to make moves, and we don't make counter moves within the constitutional framework. We do that. We vindicate the Constitution. At least we try. And on the other hand, I think the court of public opinion in an open democracy is the ultimate arbiter of power. And that is where we do battle. That's where the Institute has done battle for 95 years, thereabouts. And I think that, yes, this is part of it. All of these bills address that very serious South African yearning for a practical way forward. We know we come from a terrible past. We know that the last 15 years have not gone well. We've got I think we've got the highest average negative answer rate to the question, is your country going in the right direction or the wrong direction, done by Ipsos on their international polls. Mlandi figured that out. And so, people know the country's going in the wrong direction, but people who want to shut things down, people who want to just complain, hana, no. We need someone to come in there, be a Rassie Erasmus, okay? Be the Rassie Erasmus of South African policy and say, okay, we just lost to Japan. It's 2017. We've had the worst thing. If you just change a few basic principles in how you run the show, this country can be a world leader on many fronts. And we could be, in the next 20 years, the country that does the best at eradicating poverty within its borders. That is a very seriously achievable goal. This is very serious part of that work, is reaching out to people to say it's possible. It's not that we lack the talent. It's that we lack the structure to let that talent do the work it wants to do.
Makone, can I very quickly come in there? I was archival reading through old IRR surveys, and in the 1988-89 South Africa survey of the Institute of Race Relations, there's a little paragraph reporting that an opinion poll published in March 1987 found that white support for the Group Areas Act has fallen to 27%. This is 4 years before the repeal of that law. It is 5 years before the 1992 referendum endorsing the Reformation Project. And it is 7 years before the 1994 election and 10 years before the enactment of the new constitution. So if you want to understand how upstream from real politics and law and constitutional lawmaking the court of public opinion is, remember that little factoid. White South Africans changed their position 10 years before it became a constitutional reality. That's why when we lobby, we see ourselves as a lobby, not just for decision makers, not just for those in power, but for the people, because this is the highest court of law and it's the highest chamber of the legislature, public opinion.
Indeed. Two questions that I'm going to tie in together here, just generic policy, economic sort questions. The first is from Brian Scallon, and he asks, how do you create and divide up the economy? And the second one here was from Gosnati Magagula, who asks, what is the difference between making money and building lasting wealth? Is it about tactics? What about alignment? Any comments from either of you on those. And is it okay if we go over time? Because we are now at the 59-minute mark, and I thought we may want to get through questions before we put it close. Gabriel?
I'll take the second question first, and I'll leave the other one. So, a fun fact is that the world's 21st century most famous socialist, Thomas Piketty, really did a lot of silly things, but he did one smart thing, which is to look at this thing of like the difference between getting some income and building real wealth. And so he looked at, in the same way for an individual, you can think, how much do you make in a year? What's your annual salary? And then you can think to yourself, how much do you have in the bank? What's your house worth if you have a house or property? And then you can get a ratio. And if you listen to Classic FM as an example, or any of the radio stations that advertise to older South Africans, you'll hear that the relevant ratio you need to enter into retirement in a stable and healthy way needs to be quite high. You probably want to sort of own 40 times more than you earn to be able to relax. And then you hear that, and then you get very worried, and you go back to listening heavy metal, like, or something else, not that calm classical music. So, but you can do the same thing for a country, and the country of
I think we may have.
I'm pausing here because I think I have a signal. But if I'm with you, I'll say our ratio in South Africa is extremely low. It's about 2.5 to 1. That is where Europe was after 2 world wars and a Great Depression, where they sort of deliberately, a lot of wealth had been destroyed. So, and why is that important? A lot of people don't realize South Africa, we make a lot of money actually, but we're not good at building wealth. And the simplest measure of building wealth is gross fixed capital formation. That's SARB's statistic that they do every year, every quarter, to see how many factories have been built, how many bricks have been put on top of each other, or real hardware has been installed that you can't move. And South Africa's ratio there has been less than half of what the ANC said it needs to be in order to deal with our problems. That's a long build up to the very simple answer. To get to the point where we're building real wealth, right now we've got an economy where a lot of the middle class is consuming, they're running on a treadmill, and the big money is often just evaporating off into other countries. We have 1.7 trillion rand in pent-up investment. That means money that's sort of invested in a very liquid or foreign-based form that would rush into South Africa the moment this became an attractive investment destination from a policy perspective. So what you need to do to build real wealth is change the policy. These policies need to change so that your whole neighborhood is going up. Even if you're just taking care of your garden, if everyone else is also taking care of their garden, and the roads are being kept nice and not being pitted with potholes, and the government is doing the curbside, and the place is safe, then your property value will go up. The 600,000 rand house will become a 1.2 million rand house in 15 years if the whole neighborhood is governed properly. And if the whole country is governed properly, that 1.7 trillion will be reinvested in. And that's how you get the real solid middle class wealth.
Hermann, I'm coming to you with the first question from Brian Scallon about how you create and divide up the economy.
Yes, so I think that might be, if I'm understanding Brian correctly, that might be a bit of a sardonic comment on the nature of politics being about how do you create and divide up the economy. And I think there's some truth in that, and it is unfortunate. But what I would want to say about the nature of South African politics is that we shouldn't assume it is a set thing. If we look back over the 116 years of our country's existence from 1910 onwards, politics has meant many different things. And it has been up for grabs in terms of what its objectives should be, generationally and even in shorter intervals than that. I had the honor of last night being a guest speaker alongside William Gumede at an event, and what stood out to me is one of the small victories of the 2024 election that sometimes gets glossed over or just missed is the fact that we are no longer a dominant party country. For the first time in effectively a century, we are not that, and I do not see us returning to that. That is very important because research from Canada and America show that dominant party systems lead to an overall degradation of the quality of politics and politicians. And if you think about it, it becomes obvious. The dominant party, with the assumption of perpetual power, faces no incentive to renew, to recruit, to introspect. It just assumes power, so it becomes a question of pure gatekeeping. On the opposition side, you don't get to attract new talent because it's very, very difficult for an opposition party to convince someone either from a comfortable retirement or a successful career to come and sit in the opposition benches for a democratic term. But what happened in 2024 was magical. That changed. A door that has been shut to the South African talent pool of politics has inched open. 10 years ago, Leon Schreiber was an academic. Today, he is Minister of Home Affairs. It is possible that today in South Africa, there are people in business and academics, in the clergy, in the NGO sector, in retirement, who feel a sense of public duty and service, but have been disgusted, rightly so, and repulsed by the dominant party power of a century of South African politics, meaning that you cannot feasibly, even if you have the instinct to serve in politics, you do not see a healthy route towards doing that. And that is changing. So when we see politics as how to create and divide up the economy, that might be its present definition, but I think it is also its petering definition. I think one of the privileges to be in South Africa, in a country where the problems are so visceral, is that the moral argument to get involved becomes stronger. And what has repelled, I think, honest people of joining politics and redefining it away from just a divvying up of the economic cake, that has changed. And that has changed due to the voter. So we can redefine politics. And I would urge people to take it seriously and to consider that politics isn't the same as it was a year ago. The amount of change that has happened, the mere fact that we had a national debate about that is unheard of in our political history. You can draw a direct link between the voting and the vatting for the first time, and that's potent. So politics, yes, we might see it as a cynical exercise in power and in division, but it need not be that. And I think that is changing. I think the moral argument for that is effectively unstoppable in a country where the moderate pragmatism of the people has been the baseline of any hope that we've had through our troubled history.
I'll pair these two questions as well because they seem to address the issue of age, possibly in empowerment laws. Jonathan van der Walt often wonders whether BEE is focused on the wrong age, and they say it surely should have improved education skills and training for those that apartheid purposely disadvantaged to give a foundation where the focus could be on merit with only the balance tipped by race. I think Gabriel, that reminds me of that data point you shared about race as a tiebreaker. And then we had one here from Sipe Pemateti, who says, wouldn't substituting BEE for, say, a policy such as young persons' economic empowerment be a value for money move, legislatively speaking? And he adds, as a first step in moving away from cosmetic economic inclusion. Gabriel, let me ask you.
Okay, I'll tackle that. So yeah, I mean, I just think that on value for money, it it really does help to do what Makone did, which was thinking about the tuck shop thing, which I had the same thing when I was in primary school. For me, I think about buying laptops. Those are big purchases for me. And I've tended to think about it and kind of ask people. And I think like the thought process sometimes goes like this, you know, do I want the cheapest laptop? Well, then it's going to get too slow. The battery's going to die. The thing's going to stop working in 8 months. So then I don't want the cheapest. The most expensive, no. You know, Apple Macintosh, I'm sorry to say a brand's name. Like, I think part of the extra cost there is just to look fancy. I don't think it's worth it. So other people have a counter argument. That's an opinion. And then I think to myself, like, okay, there's some Chinese brand I've never heard of before. And it's like 30% cheaper than the South Korean brand that I'm used to, or the American brand. Do I go for the Chinese one to save that money, or am I worried about, to use a Hong Kong, you know, do I worry about like a kind of a problem there of getting an inferior good? And some of my friends, you know, I'll phone, oh, I've tried this thing. I've tried that thing. It didn't work. It did work, whatever. That's a process. And that's for a purchase, maybe 20,000 Rand. I don't know what they cost right now. But, you know, that's like if you're up and down, it's like if you're spending 25 or 15 or 12 or 30, it's like the numbers are big enough that you can kind of feel how it's worth putting in a couple of hours to thinking about this. And if you I actually worked in a procurement office for a small business that had about 30 staff. And we were putting in orders sometimes for 10 million Rand. And, you know, then you can spend a good week and a half with a team of 3 people really figuring out where you're going to spend this money. And that was like not a lot of time, really. We should have had more time, but we just couldn't do it. It's really, now, if someone has to come and tell me halfway through that process, please buy from young people because that's good for the country. I'm telling you, it's the same problem. That's not value for money. Like, if someone says buy from the Chinese or don't buy from the Chinese because of the Communist Party, it's like, I'm buying shoes here. I'm buying a laptop here. What I want is the best value for money. I much prefer the politics of South Korea to China. I would, any day of the week, if I had infinite money, I'd only buy from South Korea, not buy from China. But I'm buying a laptop here. I'm going to buy the one that's the best value for money. Youth, whatever social identity group you want to stand up for, that's not value for money. Value for money is you look at the good or the service, you look at the price, and you let someone focus on that. And Hermann's point there is that it is compassionate. And it's compassionate if the person who's saying from a management perspective where you should be buying in the first place, not where you should be buying, what you should be buying for. Someone wants to buy drugs. Let me buy some dacha or some heroin. I can get the best value for money. It's not going to be very good for the overall utility of the business environment. If I'm buying a laptop, that can make a real difference to our doing good work. So the administrator has a role to play. Who's the administrator? It's the voter. It's the people that they vote for at municipal level, at national level. So I think sometimes people, I'll finish by saying this. Sometimes people don't like the value for money idea and they want to do the youth thing or the BEE thing or the DA's plant trees thing because they've given up on governance. They've given up on the people's representatives making that high level choice so that now when you're maximizing value for money, you are actually reaching a useful target. And they're like, let's just let the bureaucrat, let's just let the official, the Excel spreadsheet accountant, procurement officer, let's give them all the decision-making power. I think it's a panicked choice. It's a choice where you're trying to get one person to do 7 things and they're trying to kick the ball and chase the ball and catch the ball and throw the ball. And they're trying to do all of the things all of the time. No. To go back to rugby, because we're good at rugby, you get the hooker to throw the ball into the line out. You get the fly half to kick the ball through the poles. Each person gets their own function and their own task. If you can just let the procurement officers focus on one thing, I think they can actually do the job. They haven't had a chance yet in 25 years. Give them 10 years. And I think that'll help the youth more than anything else. And if it doesn't work, let's revisit this conversation after that.
We have 2 questions from Nick Kluter. I'm going to present the first one to you, Gabriel, and the second one I'll leave to Hermann. It's a bit technical. They ask about the value for money bill, and it says the value for money bill forbids or limits race-based preferential scoring, which contradicts the triple PFA and the BEE triple BEE requirements. Given that they are irreconcilable, would your conflict wins, in quotes, clause prevail in court if ever passed? And the second one for you, Hermann, is why did the DA bother with their economic inclusion for all bill when they could have just used the IRR's EED bill? I think that's the Freedom from Poverty bill, and even the Value for Money bill. Has the IRR ever received any feedback from DA politicians about this? And we'll have one last question, and then we'll close the webinar.
Okay, thank you. I'll say one thing about the DA because it's already come up. They have agreed to meet with us to talk about the value for money for bill. Let's see if they go. I'm looking forward to that. We're still finding a date. I'd be very eager to hear their side because we are very sympathetic to any political party that wants to make a change, and especially one that wants to dilute the significance of race. We encourage that. That's very important. Okay, on the technical question, I like that question. It's a standard fact that in South African law, a later law will trump an earlier law. Or if you don't like Trump, you can say, well, Biden or whatever. I'm sounding like Herman now. I've been on this thing for so long. Anyway, you know what I mean. It is true that the triple PFA, the procurement law that was passed in 1999-2000, has like a special status. And that's because the Constitution says you need a special requirement for a law that will somehow set up a system that will help protect or advance persons who've suffered discrimination. If you live in cloud cuckoo land, you might think it's only possible to help a black person by first identifying them as a black person. Then the value for money bill will not work. But if you can understand, I think, Hermann's transcendental notion of compassion, which is very deeply rooted in a way of thinking that you can help soul to soul. You can help others without knowing without anyone knowing anything about race. It's also a very common sense point. We think we have drafted this thing in a way that it is compliant with that requirement, that it specifically is the best way to comply with that requirement, to protect and advance persons that are discriminated against, that have been discriminated against. And I will finish by saying this. In case you think Gabriel Crouse, who has no law degree, who is after all just a sort of hairy interloper across the stage of South African discourse, has no real authority to say what is or is not consistent with the Constitution in terms of Section 217. We have former Chief Justice Raymond Zondo, most people have probably heard of him, who was the commissioner of the State Capture Commission, most people have probably heard of it, who said in no uncertain terms that maximizing value for money is the best way to go forward, that it serves the national interest, and that it is the thing that procurement officers should all be advised to do. Of course, the Zondo report would not give advice inconsistent with the Constitution. We take it as the highest authority for our claim that our bill is the only one in town that really fits with that requirement of the Constitution. And yes, so it would knock down the triple PFA, and rightly so.
All right. Since Gabriel's already answered the question about the DA, Hermann, I'm going to ask a different one from R. van Rensburg, who says, how can we change the laws in the family system of South Africa? And I actually missed one more question, which I'll ask you, Gabriel, and that would be it, I promise. They ask about the ICASA regulations, which compel companies to set aside 30% for license fees. And Mandla asks, how can EED help if it can in this situation?
So firstly, on the family law system, the question might have to be a bit more specific, because there are many components of family law. It could be with regards to the establishment of marriages or marriages-like contracts.
Let me add, there's two exclamation points under the first question, and they say thousands of innocent children and good parents of all cultures and race are being destroyed because of corruption and incompetence in the family law system?
So this might not be the most pleasing answer, but I do believe it is the most realistic. Governments can't fix families. They can break them. They can break families, and we saw apartheid do that. But they can't fix families. They can fix economies, and they can fix incentives. And part of probably the most brutal legacy of apartheid is the social fabric of our Black families being torn asunder, and really not given the chance to heal yet. So I don't think the family law system is a high it's a high priority. Let me rephrase. I don't think the family law system should be the prime target for policy solutions. I do think it comes down to the economy. The health of your society is downstream from your economy, whether it is the dignity that comes from being an active participant in an economy in your own right, or whether it comes from the tax revenue that's raisable from a growing economy that makes compassionate state intervention policies and support and welfare possible. So when it comes to the weakness of the family, my advice to the government would be make it as easy as possible for a parent to earn as much as possible and to spend as much time at home as possible. And I think those are questions of economic empowerment. And I think if you start disentangling that knot, it allows you to disentangle the subsequent knots. But if you don't get that knot right, you won't be able to disentangle the rest of the system. So I think it really is the economy.
Thank you, Herman. And Gabriel, just that last question of Mandla about EED and things like the ICASA 30% equity laws.
Yeah, so I mean, ICASA is also looking at changing those laws. There's like a debate underway as to how that's going to go. And part of their consideration there is to say, bandwidth auctions and so on will be racially streamed. And that 30% set aside thing, I think, has become famous because of Starlink. But, I would not conflate that with EED. I think the brilliant side of EED is making ordinary South Africans procurement officials for housing, health, and education. It's like where the government's already spending money, let the ultimate decision maker be on where that money goes, a person who's actually going to then use that good or service that the money is going to spend on. Because to paraphrase Milton Friedman, no one spends your money better than you do. Okay, you know how to spend that money, so you get to make the choice. Now, the ICASA thing, it's like, if Starlink or some international company wants to come and make internet cheaper in rural areas so that more companies can flourish there, so that more virtual workers can go there and be spending into those local economies, should the government, as it has done, slow that down for a few years while it negotiates exactly how much of their ownership they have to set aside and exactly where they should set it aside to? And should we replace the set aside from BEE requirements to EED requirements and say, oh, you must plant trees or you must donate to some charity fund, that feeding scheme? No. At some point, again, you've got to do division of labor. Let the people who are very good at putting satellites into space and that they can provide seamless electricity internet to the entire country at a very low cost. Let them do that, and let other people worry about planting trees or feeding schemes or whatever. The system of division of labor is the most tried and tested way to actually get poverty upliftment and excellence at the top and so on. And so I think those issues are separate. What should happen with ICASA is that regulations should completely scrap any of those ownership requirements. And we should not be afraid of foreigners coming to invest here. Is our problem that we don't have enough? It's a crazy thought to think South Africa's got too much money. When people want to come and invest here, we should chase them away or make them jump through some hoops in order to come into business here. That's not our problem. Our problem is we don't have enough money. So if people want to come and do it, put their money here, I really do think we should say, thank you so much. That's a great help. You pay your fair share of tax, and that's it.
Awesome. Those are two of some of the brightest minds in policy and law in South Africa, being Gabriel Crouse and Hermann Pretorius. Thank you both so much for your generosity. We've gone over 20 minutes in terms of the allotted time. Thank you also to the audience for joining this discussion. I've read all your comments, your questions. I think I've addressed most of them. We certainly appreciate you joining us here. That is the 4 transformative what South Africa can be bills for a free, fairer, and prosperous South Africa. If you're interested in joining this force of a movement, you can go on the IRR website, find what SA can be. It's IRR/what SA can be. And there you can sign a pledge where you affirm that you agree with the principles, the policies of this vision of a prosperous South Africa under the What I Say Can Be pledge. And from then on, you are part of this movement. So thanks again for joining. I know we've gone over time. I apologize for that. We do appreciate you all. And that is it from us. Thank you and goodbye. Thank you.